Okay, so today I'm here to talk about my master's thesis. My master's committee is Mike, Jean, and Fed. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for all of your help so far in constructing this study and helping create it and make it better. I had some alternative titles for this presentation. One of them is Good Science versus Bad Data. The other is my last science presentation, because unfortunately this is my last, probably going to be my last science presentation. Previously, we found this effect called the Egocentric Temporal Order Bias. This is my first year project. It was published in Science Advances and Scientific Reports. Super excited about that. And basically, we found that there's a difference in subjective time perception. When there are two events that happen at the same time, you created one, something else created the other one. You tend to think that the event that you generated happened first. So that's really cool, but we don't really understand why. The mechanisms that we want to take a look at in this study were the effects of action, prediction, and attention on generating this ETO bias. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. We'll come back to the slide. It's mostly just to keep track of where we are in the presentation. So a little bit of background. There's been a lot of research on subjective time. A lot of it is really fascinating, in my opinion. Some of them are really fun, like Stetson, who worked with David Eagleman, found that time is dilated after frightening events. So there's this whole thing of like time slows down when dangerous things are happening. And the way that they tested this is they threw students off of a bridge on a bungee cord. And so when estimating the duration of how long they fell for, students thought that they fell for, I think, 36% longer than watching somebody else fall off the bridge. The important thing from this is that this is a response error. So when they're actually falling, if they have like a time that they're like, okay, press this stopwatch at like 2 seconds, they're actually still quite accurate. And so in the moment, time isn't slowed down, but recollecting upon it, it seems like time is dilated. The more relevant to my work is a lot of work on intentional binding, which demonstrates its link between voluntary action, agency, and time perception. So this is the intentional binding paradigm. Basically, you have a stimulus onset, say like a light flashing, just cueing you to perform an action. You perform the action, then there's a delay, and then an action effect. So the action effect could be like you press a button, and then after a while you hear like a click, for example. And basically what intentional binding is that as you perform this over and over and over, the delay is attenuated. So you experience the delay to be shorter than it actually is. And this causes the time that you think your action to happen a little bit further, and the action effect to come a little bit earlier in. So you can imagine as you're using a computer, there might be some delay, it might be a slow old computer. And basically, as you continue to use this computer, it feels more and more simultaneous. You adapt to that delay, and you experience the effect and the action to be closer together in time. So the first year project, I was talking to Mike about this, I think the summer before I started grad school here. And we were thinking about different situations in sports. Mike, of course, loves psychology experiments that have sports context. And so we're wondering, in cases of basketball and soccer, there are frequently cases that people from opposite teams hit the ball at the same time, the ball goes out of bounds, and then players get into heated arguments about which team the ball should go back to. And so on one hand, it's easy to assume that, well, they're just lying so that they get it back, like it's advantageous. If it's close enough, then maybe like both people actually know that like one person hit it out, but they're both gonna say like the other person hit it out first. But we're wondering if there could actually be something perceptual going on here. And so we set up this experimental paradigm that had participants sit across from each other at a table. There's a divider between the participants. and a light cue that's synchronized between them. And so the light flashes, and we ask the participants to tap each other on the hand. So both participants use their right hand to tap the other person on the left hand. We have a sensor in their left hand that detects when that tap happens. And then they make a temporal order judgment about which event happened first. So did you tap the other person first? Did the other person tap you first? Participants receive no feedback whatsoever. They're not incentivized to respond one way or another. It's completely anonymous. And they don't know what the other person said. This is getting into some of the graphs that we're going to see. The responses are binary. So they're either going to be at the top or the bottom. Those are the binary responses, which correspond to judgments of I touched first or they touched first. This is the model of their response. So this is the psychometric curve of their ability to discriminate between the touches. And then roughly, these two quadrants basically mean they're correct, that they judged that they touched first when they actually touched first, that they judged that they touched later when they actually touched later, and then these two boxes are generally incorrect. So we'll be talking about this a lot more later. It's okay if it's a little confusing now. This is what the data actually looked like for that first year project. And so across 3 different conditions, 2 in which participants tapped each other in the hand, and then 1 that they were comparing their own touch against a mechanical touch, 1 that they were comparing their own touch against a sound, we find that there's a bias in all 3 of these conditions across participants, which basically means that if the touches are actually simultaneous, participants tend to respond that they think their touch happened first. The measure that we're actually looking at here is what we call the egocentric temporal order bias, and it's basically a deflection on the y-intercept. So getting into our current study, for the first year project, we found this bias. So what? There are a few different reasons why we might care about the ETO bias. The one that I'm most interested in, and maybe why I'm doomed for a career in science, is scientific merit. I think it's just interesting that we found this thing and I want to know more about it. But there are other implications. It tells us about how our consciousness integrates perception and action together. It can inform decision-making and human-machine interfacing. So if you imagine like 50 to 100 milliseconds, probably not such a big deal in a lot of things that we do in life. But if it's like you're driving down the highway at 70 miles per hour, and then there's suddenly an accident in front of you, that difference, if your car is able to let you know or take some preliminary action, that can probably save your life. So what we want to really look at here is in our original manuscript, we interpreted the egocentric temporal order bias as, first of all, egocentric. So it depends on the vantage of the person and your own action. And then the other thing is we interpreted it as supporting a feed-forward model of consciousness. And so what we mean is that if you are able to predict something, such as your own action, that information is already incorporated in your consciousness, you're already planning it, and you have this feed-forward model that accounts for your action. But you don't know when the other touch is going to happen, so it's not in your feed-forward model, and it takes some extra time to process. And so that's the interpretation of why we see this effect. So the potential mechanisms that we've identified that could be driving the ETO bias are action binding, feed-forward prediction, and attention. A really important note, and this is going to be relevant for the entire presentation, is that these mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. So our hypothesis that action might be causing intentional binding, there's some reason to believe this. Intentional binding, for example, is heavily associated with the pre-supplementary motor area. And studies before have shown that feed-forward prediction is inadequate to generate intentional binding on its own. You really need to have this action to see that effect. Feed-forward predictability, again, the way that we interpret originally is this constructive model of consciousness. And then attention, we have prior entry. Everybody knows and loves prior entry. And so this is a known effect that attending to something comes to attention more quickly than objects that we're not attending to. And so basically these are the three things that we are trying to look at to figure out what is actually driving this bias. Again, I touched on this briefly, but they are interlinked, and so you can't perform a voluntary action without feed-forward mechanisms. You can't predict a stimulus without attention, but you can attend to something without a predictable event or action. So experiment 1 is action, prediction, and attention. Experiment 2 is prediction and attention. Experiment 3 is only attention. I keep talking about this because it's important, but the mechanisms are not mutually exclusive, which means that if we observe ETO bias in all experiments, it doesn't mean that action is driving it, it doesn't mean prediction is driving it. We need to be really parsimonious with our interpretations, but it is kind of unsatisfying to just say, okay, well, we don't really know. And so we can use Bayesian factors analysis to give us an idea of if these effects are unique. So getting into the methods, you guys probably don't care about this that much, but I think it's important to have here. We use two piezoelectric sensors, which are what we use to collect the time touch data. We had two limit switches that participants used to make judgments about temporal order. So they would stick their hands through these little cardboard slots so that they can't see their hands in some conditions. And basically, their pinky would be situated that they could just tap it with whichever hand they thought was touched first. There was an LED that we used in experiment 1, an Arduino which collected all of the data, and yeah, I used a lot of cardboard. This is a model of the data flow, and so you can see those piezoelectric sensors there. They're what give us the time difference data. In my data, it's always the right-hand time with the left-hand time subtracted from it. So you take the right-hand timestamp, and then you subtract the left-hand timestamp, and that's your time difference. And then there's a basic filter that's basically just like if both hands weren't touched within like 5,000 milliseconds, then don't count the trial. The two limit switches are what give you the temporal order judgment information, and all of that is processed in the Arduino, and that's sent to the computer with the demographic and metadata for each trial. So in our first experiment, we basically were trying to replicate our finding for ETO. We did make a slight modification that the participant can't see their left hand, and that's primarily for consistency across our different experiments. And so you can see the participant can only see the right hand. They're sitting across from the experimenter. There's a light that flashes, and then the participant taps a sensor. The experimenter taps a sensor on the participant's hand. The participant makes a judgment about which touch happened first. Experiment 2, our prediction condition. We basically have the same paradigm, except the light is gone, and the experimenter performs both of the touches. The experimenter has a cue. They tap both the participants' hands, and then the participant is told to look at their right hand. And so they know when that touch is going to happen. They see it happening. And so they have feed-forward predictability for that hand, but not the left hand. In the attention condition, we originally had this distractor task. It was way too difficult. It was a very simple distractor task. We just had like a little stopwatch, and then we asked participants to read out the like tens of milliseconds when their hand was touched. But it was like that small distraction was enough that their ability to discern the order of these events, even when they were like 50 to 100 milliseconds apart, was just completely gone. So their responses were completely awful. So what we ended up doing was we took the paradigm from experiment 2, and we basically just covered both hands. We still told them to look at their right hand, even though they couldn't see it, and we asked them to attend to their right hand. So here are the three conditions laid out. I'll just give like a few seconds so that you guys can take a look at it. The color coding is going to be consistent across, so action's always going to be red, prediction's always going to be green, attention's always going to be blue. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just to help organize and keep everything consistent. Okay, so let's get into the results. What did we find? In order to get the touch time difference, we did use piezoelectric sensors, and so we got some sense of like pressure data. I didn't use it for this study. I was interested in potentially looking at it in the future, but basically we used a fractional peak latency measure, which is really common in electrophysiology measures. Thank you, Gene, for bringing this to my attention. I don't know how long ago, but it really came in handy here. Fractional peak latency is really nice for a lot of different reasons, and so I have these 2 citations here in case you're interested if you're doing any kind of data analysis like this. And you can see from our data that these trials over here on the right side, it's remarkably good at finding when these touches happen, even when there are these like kind of artifacts from movements. It's really good at finding the stimulus onset for when the touches actually occur. We did filter a little bit here. Basically, when the touches were outside of 500 milliseconds, like it's so obvious who touched first that we're not going to count it. And then there are some cases that people are really, really slow to respond, and I'm really not sure exactly what was going on for those trials. But basically, if they didn't give their temporal order judgment within 5 seconds of the trial happening, then we took it out because they probably, at that point, I don't know what they're doing. So revisiting this really quick, again, there are going to be binary responses in the data that are going to be at the top of the bottom. The model going through the middle, this little black dashed line that you see here, that's the model that we generate, the psychometric curve for that participant or that condition. And then generally, if it's in the top right or the bottom left, those were correct responses, and the top left and bottom right are incorrect. Okay, so I got to this point. I collected all my data, and I wanted to take a peek at it and see how it looks. And so I took a look at some of the data, and I noticed that for some of the participants, the models were really kind of extreme. So if you look at this one at the top left, or the top left, this first graph, this is saying that when touches happened at the same time, they responded that the experimenter touched them first, like over 90% of the time, which doesn't seem like it can possibly be right. And so I noticed that this one was shifted like pretty far to the left. This one shifted pretty far to the right. And I guess kind of like intuitively, I was wondering if you can see the distribution of the responses. They're all kind of shifted to the left here, all kind of shifted to the right here. So I wanted to see if there was any correlation between the average time of the touches for a given participant and the predicted ETO, because there's not supposed to be an effect there. Let's say that. And so I plotted average time and ETO here. ETO is basically just a y-intercept of the regression. And even without any data analysis, you can tell this is bad, right? If we do a linear regression through it, it's really bad. So this is a huge problem. And when I first came across this, I think I went through all of the stages of grief probably in about 5 minutes. I'd never seen anything like this before in my data, and I wasn't really sure what to do because we couldn't collect any more data. So let's think for a moment. Why would average time even affect ETO, right? Why would, if the majority of the touches happened one way or another, that one person was consistently faster or slower, why would that affect our measurement of ETO? So cognitively, there are a lot of binding factors and temporal adaptation effects that we know about. Some of them I mentioned earlier with like intentional binding. There was this great study by Bachman that showed that if you have 2 events that are like in sequence, but participants believe that they're supposed to be simultaneous, you can actually get them to think that the order is reversed by like reducing the delay, even though the order is still there. So that's a fascinating study. You can reverse people's perception of temporal order without reversing the temporal order of events. But also statistically, there's been a lot of work looking at how logistic regression coefficient estimates and model stability are affected by skewed independent measures. And I'll show a GIF that I made in just a moment. And then also metacognitively, if you have these participants here, and say, for example, the experimenter is just really slow. The experimenter always taps you like later than you tap them. you might after a while just be like, I don't really know what's going on, and then deliberately respond that the experimenter touched first sometimes when they're like, maybe I'm just like not perceiving this right, or maybe I'm not doing this right. And so there are a few different reasons that we might expect this to happen. Statistically, I wanted to take a look at what this might actually look like in terms of like, what does reduced regression stability really mean? And so what I have here is in the blue, I have a participant's actual regression model. And then in the red, I have responses, independent measures that are fed through this model. And then I generate a new regression model based off of the results of that, if that makes sense. So we have a model for the participant. We take new independent measures, feed it into this model, and see what the resulting model looks like. And so basically what I'm doing is I took a Gaussian distribution of independent measures, and they're centered at this red line that you see sweeping across the screen. So right now it's about 0. You can see that the regression is pretty stable. And as it goes off to the side, it gets more and more unstable. So really unstable on the left, it starts to stabilize in the middle. And then as it goes off to the right, it starts to destabilize again. And you see a lot of the times these regressions look totally wrong. Sometimes they don't converge at all. And this is basically showing the effect of, if you have skewed independent measures, it will affect your regression coefficients. So the right thing to do, what I really, really want to do, is to recollect this data. But we can't. We weren't able to. We can't right now. I can't really justify having myself or like an RA sit across from a participant, like strangers touching their hands over and over for like half an hour. It's just like not doable right now. So for the rest of this presentation, I basically tried my best with all of the scientific training that I've done to get the most out of my data. But we should still be careful about the conclusions that are made. Like, we shouldn't buy into this too much. We should replicate it first. But this is just my disclaimer. So what do we do now? Well, what makes most sense to me is we try to factor out the average time and basically estimate what the data would look like if the average time for each participant was 0. So if their data for the independent measure was centered around 0, what would it look like? So we have the standard binary logistic regression model. I don't want to talk about it too much. The point is we have a bias and a slope, basically. So it's like same as linear regression, you have a slope and a y-intercept, right? So same thing going on here. And basically, we just want to add one extra term here. So we have this beta 2 term, and then average time for a subject in an experiment. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this to model the data, and then we're going to plug in 0 for the time average. And so that should give us an estimate of the y values for those times if the average time for that participant was 0. Okay, so how does that actually look? Well, pretty good, surprisingly good. Much better than I thought, honestly. So in experiment 1, the action condition, we do see this ETO bias around 65%, which is basically exactly what I found in my previous 2 papers. For the prediction condition, it goes down a little bit. It's 55%, but it's still significant. And then in the attention condition, it goes away entirely. It's 0.499. You have a 50.1% chance of responding that the attended stimulus happens first. It's non-significant. And these results are kind of magical to me, that it came out so cleanly. And this plot on the left is just showing the 3 regressions that I just showed. They're just overlaid here so you can look at them side by side. And so you can see that the red line, which is the action condition, crosses the y-axis at the lowest point, which is that larger bias. And then the green one crosses at a point lower than the midline, which is we still see a bias. And the blue one basically goes straight through the center. So experiment 1 primarily serves as a replication. We see all of the 3 effects there. Experiment 2 is interesting because it tells us that the ETO bias isn't just driven by intentional binding, because we know that that is unaffected by feed-forward predictability. It requires action, it requires agency. And so just seeing that one touch is going to happen and knowing when that touch is going to happen shouldn't generate intentional binding whatsoever. And then experiment 3 demonstrated no bias, so it doesn't seem like differential attention is what's driving it. And I was honestly kind of surprised that we didn't see any effects from prior entry here. However, from this data, we still don't know if action contributes meaningfully. We know that prediction definitely does, but we don't know if that contribution of action is actually quantitatively unique. So I wanted to do a 4th experiment. I'm going to try to go through this quickly, but basically the rationale is I didn't want to reanalyze my data. I'm just super paranoid. But also I wanted to reconfirm the results from experiments 1 to 3, just looking at it a different way to see if we still see this effect across the 3 different conditions. So the idea is that I wanted to generate a unique model for each participant with average time in the model. So just like previously, we're going to have average time in that model. And then we're going to generate new independent measures using a Gaussian distribution with the same standard deviation matching each participant. And the idea is we want to get that independent measure to match the same statistical property as what the participant experienced when they actually did it, just centered at 0. And then from that, we're going to create a new model from predicted observations by running the centered independent measures through the model with an average time of 0. So I'll walk through what that actually looks like. So we have a participant here. We have their 50 trials. They're a little bit offset from 0 and 1 so that they're jittered so that you can kind of see the distribution. Otherwise, the dots just stack on top of each other and you can't really tell like how many actual responses are there. So I jittered a little bit. This is what it looks like. This is the regression model for that participant. So this is the model completely untouched. This is just, we grab the raw data, throw in the model the data. This is what it looks like. Now these red dots are a new set of independent measures. And this is what I was talking about, where we generate a Gaussian distribution of independent measures centered around 0 with the same standard deviation as their original time spread. And what we do is we feed this information back through the model with an average time of 0. And so we take our model that we have, we plug in each of these points for the x values, and then we plug in 0 for that beta 2 value. And then we get these responses that are either, that they would have responded either they touched before or they touched after. And then we can create a new simulated model for that participant. And so this is the model of the participant as best as I can do, as if their touch times were centered around 0. So we take this, we run it across all of our participants. So all of our participants have new regression models. And so you can see they're all like overlaid on top of each other. You can see the cloud of the dots at the tops and bottoms of each graph. Those are the independent responses. So those are the simulated responses of temporal order judgment. And basically we find that, oh, yeah, can't believe it's not data. I'm always surprised by how good like simulated data looks. Anyway, so we find the same results that we do in experiments 1 to 3. Basically, we find that there's a strong effect in experiment 1. There's a really strong bias there. In experiment 2, there's still a significant bias, but it's weaker. And then in experiment 3, no bias. Now, in terms of figuring out if action does have a unique contribution, we need to do a Bayesian factor analysis. And the reason is basically you can't do null hypothesis testing with most of the statistical measures that we have. And so Bayesian factors analysis allows us to compare two possibilities that either two things are the same or two things are different. And so basically we find that all three of these are unique in terms of the data distribution, which means effectively that action has a significant effect above and beyond feed-forward prediction. Also, as you would expect, the attention condition is different from action and prediction. We would really hope that this is true because there's no effect in attention. So now getting into our discussion. Again, these are the three experiments that we ran. We have a condition that compares an action to a non-action touch, a predictable touch to an unpredictable touch, and an attended touch to an unattended touch. So across our 4 experiments, we examined whether ETO bias is driven by action, feed-forward prediction, or differential attentional allocation. And we find that both action and prediction contribute significantly to our ETO bias, but not attention. And that we find that the bias is predominantly driven by action, not prediction, as we had stated in our original manuscript. There's still a lot left to be looked at for this, for the ETO bias. So here we looked at 3 mechanisms: action, prediction, attention, but there's still a lot that we don't know. For example, the ETO bias might reflect a sensory level difference in stimuli processing. So it could be that if you looked at somebody's like EEG and did an ERP analysis as they were doing this task, you might actually see onset of like an N100 sensory ERP happening differentially depending on if you perform the action or if somebody else performs the action. We also don't know if ETO is just a response bias. So we don't even know if it's a matter of like the action causes you to actually perceive something to happen first, or if the action does something that after the event happens, your ability to discriminate temporal order has been biased. And then we don't know if ETO bias actually reflects sensory onset differences. So there is some research looking at temporal dilation and constriction based off of different factors like feed-forward predictability and action. And they show that basically if you have an effect, a temporal event that's dilated, that affects your temporal order judgments about when that happened, even if it happens at the same time as something else. That's something that we can take a look at with our current data, actually, just at a cursory level, because we do have this pressure information. We know how long these touches happen. More broadly, our work contributes to a growing literature on perception-action coupling and subjective time perception. I wanted to include this last sentence from the manuscript of my master's thesis because I have been ending all of my manuscripts with a pun, and I felt it was appropriate to end my last presentation with a pun as well. And so the pun is, from calling who hit a ball out in a basketball match to figuring out who stopped first at a stop sign, or why it feels like you unfairly lost in a video game. It seems we need to take action to understand why our sense of temporal order may be biased. Okay, so page 1 of 28 of my acknowledgements. That's a joke, but I do have a lot of people to thank. Thank you to Gil and VCN for allowing me space to collect my data for my master's. It was really nice to have those isolated experiment rooms that we didn't have people walking in and out. There weren't like distractions there. We could have it really nicely controlled. Thank you to the Perl Lab, of course. And then GSI and Sigma Chi for funding this. And then I want to specifically thank Jean, Mike, and Gil for the incredible amount of support that they've given me, the like ludicrous amount of time that they've invested into my success, and all of the questions that they've answered, everything that they've taught me. And then yeah, Christine and Derek for also like, I can't even express like how grateful I am to all of you for the amount of support that I've received. I also want to specifically thank Art for both the embodied class that helped me think about things a lot clearer and also in a lot more open-minded of a way, I think. And then the CS faculty as a whole, everybody who was here when I first interviewed at ASU, like all of you being so friendly was really like the most important thing for me coming here is, and I want to thank all of you for like giving me a chance as an engineer with no psychology background coming into this. And then most importantly, I want to thank Ruby. I'm sure all of you know how important Ruby is to me, and she's supported me through everything, and I'm just eternally grateful to her. And then it wouldn't be a Thai presentation without a tricking video, and so here it is. And at this point, I will be happy to take any questions that you guys might have.